You are listening to the Visualising War and Peace podcast. In each episode, we look at how people have experienced, described, or imagined armed conflict in different periods and places, and we discuss the impact which representations of war and peace have on us as individuals and societies. Hello, my name is Alice Koenig, and I direct the Visualising War and Peace project at the University of St Andrews. Over the past few weeks, our podcast has been looking at how we talk about and understand forced migration, one of the many legacies of armed conflict. We've been interviewing a range of people who've been displaced by war themselves, and we've also been talking to artists, authors, photographers and academics about their efforts to change public perceptions of the so-called refugee crisis and help others visualise what forced migration involves. I'm delighted to be joined today by Dina Nayeri, an author and academic at the University of St Andrews. Dina spent her early years in Isfahan in Iran before moving with her family to America, where she completed her schooling and went to university. She read economics at Princeton before embarking on a career as a writer, publishing both fiction and non-fiction books and winning lots of awards. Much of her writing draws on her own experiences as a refugee and reflects on many different aspects of displacement. Her first novel, A Teaspoon of Earth and Sea, tells the story of an Iranian girl and her family who experienced separation and political oppression in post-revolutionary Iran, and it conjures a rich imaginative space for exploring what it can be like not to flee, but always to dream of an alternative life in a different country and culture. Her next novel, Refugee, again revolves around the story of a young Iranian girl who escapes to America as a child but leaves her father behind. And Dina takes the opportunity here to explore concepts of home and belonging, as well as movement and separation, as they are experienced over multiple years. Turning to non-fiction, Dina's multi-award-winning book, The Ungrateful Refugee, weaves her own story together with a host of other real-life refugee stories and asks important questions about the demands that people and governments make of refugees, while shining new light on what refugees themselves experience. Dina scrutinises attitudes to refugees and asylum seekers further in her latest book, out tomorrow on the 9th of March, Who Gets Believed, which explores practices of truth-telling alongside cultures of disbelief and underlines what inequalities persist and are enacted when we're selective and prejudiced about who we believe. She has also collaborated with photographer Anna Bosch-Meropykes to write The Waiting Place, a book which documents the struggles and dreams of 10 young refugees from Iran and Afghanistan in a refugee camp in Greece. And Dina uses this book as a basis for schools' workshops across the UK. Dina, your writing offers so many rich avenues for thinking about how we visualise and educate people about forced migration. So I'm hugely grateful to you for finding time to talk to me today. Thank you for joining me and welcome to the Visualising War and Peace podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to dive into your books in a minute, but can we first start with your own story of forced migration? When you were 8 years old, you left Iran with your mother and brother, ending up in a refugee camp in Italy before eventually being granted asylum in America and settling in Oklahoma. I wonder if you can just explain why you ended up having to leave Iran at that point and talk us through your experience of seeking asylum and starting a new life in a country far from your childhood home.
Absolutely. I was born in Iran at the time of the revolution, and my family, we lived in Isfahan. I guess we were there for the first 8 years of my life. And as you said, I had a younger brother, and my mother converted to Christianity at some point. She did that when I was just turning 6. And she was very passionate, I think, about her new faith, as she had been about her old faith. My mother's a very faithful person, and I think she found kind of the belief system that was right for her. And she was very vocal about it. She was a doctor in Iran. She had a lot of female patients, abuse victims, people, I think, who needed different ways of, I guess, reaching out for hope. And so she would tell them about her new faith, and that got her in trouble with the Islamic Republic. She was jailed a couple of times, and, she was basically in a lot of trouble. She was going to get executed. And we, through a series of events that is described in my book, The Ungrateful Refugee, we escaped. We first escaped to Tehran, where we hid out, and then to Dubai, where we were undocumented. Well, first we blew through a tourist visa, then undocumented, then onto a refugee camp in Italy.
Just be interested to hear a bit more about your experience of seeking asylum, but also your experience of starting to grow up in the US and what it was like, how people treated you and how your own sense of identity changed.
Yeah, that's such a big question, because it changed again and again throughout my life. to begin with, in the first years of my life, I guess I thought a lot of myself and our family. We were an educated family. I was the child of doctors. We were respected, I think, in our community. And I really took a lot of pride, I guess, in who I was, who my family was, and what I could do. I wanted to show the world that I was also kind of an academic, smart person like my parents. And when we became refugees, it became very, very clear that we had fallen in society. There was this feeling that no one cared anymore what we could do, or like all this brains that we had, that I was so proud of. It was part of my girlhood identity. And none of that mattered anymore, because not only were we poor, but we were this kind of outcast, displaced, wretched class of society. And the way that my mother was talked to, listened to, changed. The way that I was treated changed. And this was in the camp. We were just all huddled down with other displaced people, and we took care of each other. But we saw how the Italians looked at us, the people outside of the camp. There were the charity workers who were kind, but there wasn't a lot of dignity in the way they gave charity. And then beyond that, of course, we were just outsiders in their country. And I think it was easy to see that we weren't necessarily always wanted. When we went to Oklahoma, I worked so hard in the camp to learn English, and even before then, and to read books and to be caught up in school. When we arrived in Oklahoma, I was very aware, am I going into the right grade? Am I going to start school on the first day of the school year so I won't be the new kid? I didn't even think, of course, you'll still be the new kid. They've all gone to school together since kindergarten. But I thought, okay, how can I mitigate all these things so that I can be normal again and people can look at me from the point of view of my personality, my skills, the things I wanted to be known for. So I went in kind of expecting that, but very, very quickly, the children homed in on things like my accent, my clothes that were terrible from a charity shop. I looked different, of course. There weren't people of color, I guess, really in my school. So I was dark compared to them, even though I guess I present as white-ish right now. But yeah, they'd never known anyone from Iran. At the same time, around then, the Gulf War was happening. It was the early 90s. And that brought me a lot of hate, a lot of abuse, because people mistook Iran and Iraq. They didn't really look into the whole thing of, well, we were also put in danger by Saddam Hussein. The first 8 years of my life were war with Saddam Hussein. We were bombed by Saddam Hussein. I am no friend of that particular regime. But the thing is that these are children. They didn't know the nuances. They just thought, oh, well, here's the Iraqi kid, even though I was Iranian. And so, yeah, there was a lot of abuse in school. My mother was working in a factory, and so she was constantly looked down on, even though she had, a medical degree. She was an MD from a top university in Iran. But I think it was difficult because the thing that we lost, aside from all our money and our home and our family, was our dignity as a place in the world.
Yeah, you just painted a really powerful picture there of the work that someone like you had to do to mitigate the many secondary consequences, the many secondary impacts of forced migration, that loss of status, of dignity, of an identity beyond being a refugee or an identity beyond being other and different. I read in your book, The Ungrateful Refugee, that the response that you got from children very initially in the first few days was, you look different, a sense of being unable to place you, but then did sort of materialize and translate into a more specific form of racism that you understood they had learned, in fact, from their parents, that they went home from school and talked about this new kid in school. And another layer of othering and racism and prejudice came back with them from that older generation. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think because they were going home and talking about the new kid at the same time as some of the war stuff was happening, I think that the bullying evolved. In fact, I remember kind of my first day in school, there was a couple of snickers about what I was wearing and my accent, but, I was like a pretty little girl. And so there was a couple of people that tried to befriend me, and I remember actually this story. This is such a silly story, kind of from the point of view of us as adults. It just has embedded itself into my memory. But there was this kind of very cute, popular boy who came and tried to be my friend. And it was a week later, that boy wouldn't even come anywhere near me. And then there was the taunts about, they would call me a cat eater. I don't know where they got that. They would do the kind of ching chongese that children did at Asian students, which of course, didn't make sense to me at the time, because if you're going to be racist, at least use the tropes from the right part of the world. But it was all very, very confusing. Whatever kind of racist foreign kid bullying they could think of, they threw at us, whether it be the kind of mocking the language, mocking my accent, running up to me and asking me to say a word, or do you know what this word means? Or saying an ordinary word and pretending that it's an insult, and watching me cry, that kind of stuff. And then, of course, the words that they called us that clearly came from the adults that were specific to the Middle East and, came from the war. I remember I heard that and I thought I was utterly speechless, and I was 11 or 12. But yeah, I think the evolution of the kind of bullying and the severity of it really spoke to what was going on in terms of political and belief back home, especially when it got specific to the Middle East. Naturally, kids are going to be skeptical about a new kid at the beginning, especially if that kid looks poor. Those kind of early days things were not really curiosity. They weren't so much bullying. They were mean, but it got really bad later when Iran and Iraq and all those things came into the picture.
Yeah. So I want to return to your memoirs a bit in a minute, but first it would be nice to talk more about your fiction writing. And I'm really struck by the fact that your novel, A Teaspoon of Earth and Sea, which features twin girls Saba and Mahtab, really focuses on the twin who stays behind in Iran with her father, dreaming of America and learning as much English as she can, while the other twin and her mother disappear somewhat mysteriously. So I want to ask you a little bit about your fiction writing generally. How much of yourself were you putting in that fiction writing? And why did you choose in your first novel to focus on Saba, the girl who stays, not Mahtab, the girl who goes?
Wow, this is such a cool question. I think the reason is because the novel is me doing what Saba was doing. So Saba imagines her other self in America, and she gets a caricatured America. If you notice the way that I wrote the America parts, there's inaccuracies, there's kind of melodrama, there's silliness, there's things that the America you'd make in your head if you were just creating it out of movies, right? But the fact is that I created the Iran I would have lived with out of my early memories, plus a bunch of albums and videos and movies and talks with my dad, still there. And in that way, I imagined Saba in the way Saba imagined Mahtab. And I think if a part of it was a clever way to kind of disguise and hide my literary mistakes. If I make any mistakes in this book, it is because of this meta thing in which I have imagined my other self. Saba is my other self and Mahtab is Saba's other self. And as a result, Mahtab is a second degree caricature of me. And I loved the circularity. And I thought about it for, the years that I was writing that book. I imagined myself all the time in this romantic version of Iran that doesn't exist. I imagined myself falling in love with some Iranian man who plays guitar. And then we have a big bathhouse in our house, the hammam, and we have vegetables outside, and we have our land, and we speak our language, and we cook our food and play our music and feel so rooted and part of a place. And our children know that they belong to that land. And gosh, it still makes me emotional to think of that dream that I had as a young woman. And Saba reflects that dream, but with the understanding that, things would have been tough for me. It would be incredible hardships to endure to cut up that romance. But at the same time, I like thinking of her dreaming of my life and making my life, which has its own hardships, into this perfect vision of movie Harvard and movie suburban America.
Mm-hmm. And it's a novel which really sort of thematizes the split paths that your life took, the alternative life you might have lived had you stayed in Iran. And it really does play with visualization, doesn't it? It plays with visualizing how things might have been in an ideal world, in a better world, in a fantasy world. Yeah. And I think one of the really radical things about the novel is that it looks at migration and separation from the perspective of someone who doesn't move, not from the perspective of the person who does, although it's obviously impacted by other people's migration. So in your later writing, you've been increasingly explicit about the ideas and the truths that you want to communicate about forced migration. When you were writing A Teaspoon of Earth and Sea, did you have a clear agenda, a clear sense of the themes that you wanted to explore, the messages you wanted to get across, or did Saba's story emerge much more organically from your own and tell itself?
I mean, that book came straight out of my subconscious, to the point that I hated it for many years after. because, as I became a better writer, as I went through a writer's workshop, I did all of this kind of the whole New York literary scene stuff. I was kind of taught in a way to hate my first novel, as many writers are. And I hated it because I saw flaws in it and I didn't look at it for some years. And actually, funny enough, you've caught me at a moment where recently, just a couple of weeks ago, I dared look at it again with trepidation because I hate this book so much. Alice, I can't even tell you like the fire in my belly over having this be my first book, but it's all literary stuff. Like I feel I'm better than this, or I've become a better writer than this, and it is so public. But actually, I looked over it a couple of weeks ago, and I thought I was filled with like love for the person that I was and compassion for her, and like understanding that this was a no agenda book. In fact, I wasn't even aware of a lot of the political ramifications or like social ramifications of a lot of what I was writing. This came from deep in my belly. I mean, it was full of my longing. It was full of the things that I missed, the mistakes I felt like I'd made, and even the way I saw with fear the Dina I would have been if I had stayed behind, and all my cousins who stayed behind, my female cousins who, every time I see them, or hear about them, I think, oh my God, they're stuck. It makes me scared. What if I had also been stuck in that country? Especially, I felt this when I saw the recent women's revolution in Iran, the uprisings in Iran. And so that book, reading over, I just realized this is just deeply entrenched in who I was and what I wanted. Some of it I didn't even realize I wanted, which came through so very obviously to critics and readers, people who picked it up. I think I've finally gotten to an age where I can just kind of appreciate the fact that some piece of my subconscious got preserved in that book. I'm happy that snapshot of my longing in my late 20s was preserved.
Yeah, I think it's a beautiful book, and it captures some of your subconscious, but it also captures something really authentic about how a young person wrestles with the questions of staying or going, belonging and moving, and the hopes and the dreams and the visualization, as I say, of the futures and alternative paths. So your next novel, Refuge, is also a story about a family separated across continents. So in this novel, an Iranian girl escapes to America as a child, but her father stays behind, very much like your experience.
Yes.
And over 20 years, as she grows from a confused immigrant to an overachieving Westerner to a sophisticated European transplant, and I'm quoting from your website now, with the daughter and the father only get to know each other through 4 crucial visits over a couple of decades, each in a different international city. So again, can you tell us how much of your own experience of migration has fed into this novel, and what do you think it teaches us about migrant experiences more generally, from the challenges of separation to the processes of reinvention and homemaking in new places?
Yeah. Well, this novel was kind of more, it came, hard. It came in a difficult way. And the reason was because when I sold my first book, when I sold Teaspoon, I kind of sold it in a 2-book deal. And there was this second book that I had to write, which was completely undecided and unwritten. And I decided to write a story that, a novel about that kind of mirrored my days in Oklahoma as a child. And I haven't actually published that yet, but I rewrote that novel like 10 times. And every time I took it to my editor, she was like, nope, this isn't it. And she kept saying, it doesn't have the Dina magic. And I'm like, what the hell is the Dina magic? And I think what she meant is, now I understand, looking back, it's that fire, that rawness, that Teaspoon had. And she kept saying, you're, at the time I was at the Iowa Writers Workshop, and she's like, you don't over workshop it. You're over editing, you're overdoing. I want, something right out of the Dina magic. But then I realized that part of that is, so 10 drafts later, I put that one aside. And I tried to kind of go back and find myself again. And subconsciously, again, I think the book that I gravitated to writing shows that I think the thing that I'm interested in and good at is looking at these migration stories from a slant. The slant in Teaspoon was from the point of view of the person who stayed. The slant in Refuge is the point of view of the person who has now, 30 years later, is completely out of danger, westernized, and has become a chameleon, right? And that is a person I was much more interested in, or able to write well, than, say, those early days in Oklahoma, the new immigrant. And I think so actually the book came out, Refuge came out of 10 pages of kind of essayistic writing that I did about the 4 times that I saw my father since I left him at 8 years old. We would keep meeting in different countries, and we would, and each time he would be so changed to me and I would be so changed to him. And that essay was published in the New Yorker. I don't know if you found it, but that essay about me and my father over 4 visits, that it was the nugget for Refuge, and it became the novel Refuge. And it's from the point of view of a father and a daughter, and they've been separated for a long time, and they see each other 4 times. And those 4 times don't mirror necessarily my 4 times. Some of them do, some don't. And it's the culture gap. It's the gap between parents and children over many decades when the children become westernized. And for me, that was just a better story to tell, because it's an angle that isn't often, or wasn't when I published this, as often explored as the new migrant experience.
Yeah, absolutely. It's that looking at the experience in the longue durée and seeing how it plays out over years and indeed decades, and really drawing attention to the fact that that migratory experience goes on, and that process of homemaking and reinvention and wrestling with identities is a really long-running process. So, as I said earlier, The Ungrateful Refugee, a book of fact, not fiction, is your most explicitly autobiographical book. But of course, it also connects your story to many other real-life stories of forced displacement. You weave lots of stories together and communicating different aspects of refugee experiences, again, from escape to homemaking. So why did you decide you wanted this time to bring lots of different migration narratives together rather than just sharing your own?
So remember that before Ungrateful Refugee, I had written only from behind the veil of fiction, right? And that is important, first of all, because one thing I want to clarify, I feel like I always have to clarify, is that fiction, being my passion, is completely unrelated to my identity as a refugee. Utterly unrelated. And so sometimes I chafe at the fact that I have become a little bit of a kind of talking head about migration issues. And I love to do work related to activism and help, and, with NGOs and stuff. But my writing, especially fiction writing, is a part of who I am and would have been no matter where I had grown up. And so it felt like something organic and necessary to do, right? And I drew from my life, I guess, as much as I needed to, but I hid behind the fact that I am a writer. Here's me as a writer exploring the story of this fictional character. And I think in many ways that really worked for me, and still does, by the way. I love writing fiction, short stories. I continue to write and publish them. But then in 2015, a couple of things happened. First of all, there was all of the changes in the world in relation to how refugees are viewed. There was the Trump election, there was Brexit vote, there was, 15, 16. There was around the world this xenophobic kind of rhetoric, the sense of welcome wearing away. At the same time, I became a mother for the first time. And I had this little girl that is so dark and Middle Eastern and wonderful and gorgeous, but, I kind of worried for her. And then I moved to the UK. And so no longer was I in a country of which I was a citizen. When Brexit happened, I'm now a US and French citizen. So I came under a French passport, and so felt like, oh, well, here I am now, an outsider in 2 ways. Again, not only is this not my country, but pretty soon my status will change because of the French thing. And also I'm an Iranian. All of this made me want to look at this more directly and speak to the world as myself about what they're not only doing wrong, but what I believe is a wrong way or a misguided way of speaking about particular topics. And what is it? I mean, the subtitle of The Ungrateful Refugees, What Immigrants Never Tell You. That's exactly what I wanted to say. Here's some stuff that we talk about in private that we don't tell you, the settled, the native born, the white, and so forth. I felt like I need to come out from behind that veil of fiction and just speak as myself. And I needed to tell my story from my own point of view. And then also, I guess in many ways, I thought of this aspect, the Ungrateful Refugee, is kind of separate from the prose writing, which I was born to do regardless of what would happen to me. That is the fiction. It feels more kind of art and sacred. Whereas this was me speaking to the world.
I mean, the reviews of The Ungrateful Refugee gush about your storytelling powers. And of course, your writing skills help weave these stories together, help engage readers in, as you put it, the things that immigrants never tell you, the ordinary aspects of life which immigrants constantly have to negotiate, and that extra labor that forced migrants have to do all the time just to have the same basic rights as everyone else. The main part of the title, The Ungrateful Refugee, obviously indicates that one of the key themes in the book is this notion of gratitude. Yeah. And you've written elsewhere, when reflecting on your experiences in the US, you've written, there were unspoken conditions to our acceptance, and that was the secret we were meant to glean on our own. We had to be grateful. The hate wasn't about being darker or from elsewhere. It was about being those things and daring to be unaware of it. As refugees, we owed them our previous identity. We had to lay it at their door like an offering and gleefully deny it to earn our place in this new country. You've also talked about your mother being repeatedly asked to tell her story of her escape from Iran as a testimony of her salvation, but salvation by the host community, salvation through their hospitality. Again, this sort of sense of owing that salvation to other people. So I wonder if you can talk to us a bit more about this burden of gratitude that you and your family and other refugees are often expected to bear, that, you know, this idea that you should be forever thankful for the space that you're afforded. Yeah. Where does it come from, and what problems does it bring with it?
Yeah, well, I feel like a part of it comes naturally from being in a position to have to accept help. And I think so. And Iranians are such a prideful people. So I remember my mother saying something like, there is just not a worse transition from an Iranian with all this pride. Like, there's no worse culture you can come from in order to become the most abject of society. Like, she used the word wretched, the Farsi word for it. Just Iranians do not take to it. And I think that makes it's kind of funny because no one takes to it. This is one of our cultural things, is that we hate to accept charity and we hate to have to ask. And I think part of that makes you, after you're through it, kind of performative about your gratitude. And it's ugly. I find it really, really ugly. And I find it ugly to see in my fellow, refugees from anywhere, and Iranians, just to see this kind of performative thankfulness, which I know is not, even though there is authentic thankfulness in their hearts, that's not how it manifests. The way it usually manifests is so beautiful, so personal, so one-on-one. And I think this is what I was trying to say, is that gratitude is one of those things that can't be compelled or directed. It's not like, it's almost like if someone is putting their head down to prayer, thanking their God, you can't stick your foot under their forehead, you can't force them to direct that prayer to you. It's like love or respect. Again, you can't compel it. It goes where the feeler or whatever, the person having that sensation, it wants it to go. And so we refugees are all filled with gratitude. And every single day I am thankful for the fact that I am here in the West, but I get to decide where that goes. And I think when we were first arrived in Oklahoma, you were mentioning my mother. She just kept having to tell that story in church and in front of like various Bible study groups and charity groups and this group and that group. And I kept having to perform it too. Sunday school, then I wrote about it in my college essays. I have all the versions of the story, the college essay version, the Sunday school version, and it's just unseemly now. I think that is my story. And this is part of what my writing is all about. My mom gets so upset, and I think this is part of it. She gets so upset about me writing our story so much. And I think part of it is because she feels done maybe with that. But I'm finally saying it the way I want. I'm finally telling the story in my own terms, my own words, and using it with a focus on things like the sentences and storytelling and things that give me joy. Mm-hmm. I also feel okay showing our flaws. And that's another thing. I am happy to be a flawed, warty, ugly person, just like white people get to be on the page. I don't feel that I have to put on this mask. And I think a lot of times when we first arrive, immigrants and refugees, we feel like we have to show our best self, our perfect self all the time, the mask of a smile in front of the native born. And the native born feel like they're owed that because they've made space. But the fact is that they haven't done anything. And what their country has done in accepting these refugees and immigrants is a humanitarian duty. What would be the alternative? To let these people die? So the expectation of a gratitude performance is, I think, kind of the ugliest part of this. And it manifests in these unspoken ways. Like my mother said, there are 1,000 ways that people tell you things without telling you. So it's very, very hard for me to answer the question of how do they show the expectation that you be grateful? But they do. Sometimes it's even overt as, oh, you must be so happy to be here. You must be so grateful to be out of this terrible place, which was my home.
Yes, and it comes through in all sorts of institutional settings as well, citizenship ceremonies and so on. So Dina, it is very clear in your writing that one of the things that makes it so fresh and actually really very muscular is this freedom to tell your story your own way, not as other people want you to tell it, not conforming to type. And you also touched on this idea of refugees feeling that freedom to expose flaws, expose their ordinariness. Lots of refugee stories celebrate the idea of refugees made good, refugees who've survived against the odd, who've gone on not only to survive, but to succeed and to make impressive contributions in the societies where they make their new homes. And as your memoirs make clear, you've actually felt driven in that way at times, driven to achieve, to succeed, in part because refugees are taught by the people around them that they have to work harder than everyone else to earn that place. But you have also become very angry with this idea. And in The Ungrateful Refugee, you do look very critically at the ideas that we, and particularly Western societies and governments, have constructed of the good refugee or the worthy or the deserving refugee. So what attributes beyond gratitude do you think the so-called good refugee is expected to embody? And what does that tell us about how we visualize the relationship between refugees and host communities?
Well, actually part of it is this terrible double bind, which is that, the quality that, aside from gratitude, that they're expected to embody is performance. They have to be good for society, do well, a refugee who kind of makes it story. But at the same time, they can't get too big for their britches. And that's kind of hard to do. How do you not get too big for your britches if you've come from the pit of despair and done as well as they expect you to do? They look at things like, how much taxes do we pay? Well, in order to pay taxes, that means we have to earn a lot of money. In order to earn a lot of money, we have to be in positions of leadership and confidence and rootedness. That stuff comes with attitudes and behaviors that they don't want to see from former immigrants. And of course, this is generalizing in a big way, because these are different groups of people who expect these things from you. But on the whole, I think if you ask a very skeptical person who isn't very deep thinking, but whose voice is loud, what do you want from them? They want both humility and performance. They want you to be useful. So they want you to kind of reach for this second tier of society. Reach for not the stars, but like top of the tree. I reach for a way to be of service to us. And that is kind of more of the dream that you're allowed to have. Don't be too loud. Don't be too proud. Don't be ungrateful. Don't be reaching for positions of leadership. That's not ambitious. It's greedy. That kind of stuff. It's terribly burdensome to even think of what they want, to be honest.
Yeah, and it comes with a lot of don'ts as well as do's, as you say. So along with sort of don't be too loud is don't have opinions on things that might be restricted to native populations, for example.
Well, exactly. And I think this is part of the question also of what they think it is to serve and improve the country that you love, and what it is to love a country. I mean, that rhetoric of, well, if you don't like it, go back home. It's like, no, if you want to change something, that means you don't like it, So what would you do if a place was your home and you were very much a part of that place and you belonged to it and it belonged to you and you didn't feel this sense of outsiderness? First thing you do is just always be on the lookout to improve it. Like when you buy a home and you love it, you try to make it better. Nobody comes out and says, well, why don't you go back to your old home if you want to repaint the walls? What kind of way of thinking is that? I mean, the whole instinct, I guess, to say, this is what we should improve, or this is what I would like to give. This is a part of my skin. That's all out of love for the country that you've just joined. So I think there's also this kind of unthinking way of saying that a particular kind of opinion, the critique of a country, critique of policies, it belongs to the native born, because for the refugees, what it means is that they're just unhappy and ungrateful. Whereas for the native born, it means they love their home and they want to make it better. That doesn't actually make logical sense. For the native born too, it's the first sign that they're feeling at home. I feel like the first sign of my real Americanness is when I stop trying to perform Americanness, for my friends, and trying to get my accent just right, trying to get my references just right, and, dyeing my hair lighter, which I guess I still do, but whatever, because I want to, doing all that stuff and just saying, hey, these policies are bad. This way of thinking is bad. Stop treating immigrants this way. That is the first American thing that I publicly did.
So you've pointed there, Dina, to some of the ways in which refugee interaction with society, refugee voices are prescripted, as well as the expectations that are set. And that gets me thinking about your latest book, Who Gets Believed? So you've had really amazing reviews for The Ungrateful Refugee and several awards, partly because the book really does recalibrate the conversation around refugee experiences. And I think that can also be said of your latest book, Who Gets Believed? Because it's not just about refugees, it's about all sorts of marginalized people in society. And the inequalities around whose voices are listened to, and that plays into inequalities of influence and power. So can you just give our listeners a very quick outline of your main arguments in the book, Who Gets Believed?
Yeah. Who Gets Believed is also part memoir, part, reportage, and part reflection, just like The Ungrateful Refugee was. But here I kind of grapple with this lifelong obsession that I've had with who is credible and why was it that I went from being kind of a respected, believed kid of respected, believed parents to a systematically dismissed family. I mean, it created in me, as I said, a lifelong obsession with credibility. But the main point of the book, I suppose, is that I guess after all of that exploration, what I found is that credibility depends very much on our own deeply embedded shortcuts that come from the kind of stories we heard as children, the kind of ways that credibility was manifested and displayed when we were children. And it's very cultural and it's very, very narrow. And this is why immigrants are so widely disbelieved, because their performance of credibility is different from what we have in the West. And this is why, for example, you have these high-profile grifters that get billions of dollars, like Elizabeth Holmes and all of that, because they know the right performance. So really, who we believe, who gets believed, is not dependent on the truth. It depends on a performance and, that audience's desired performance and whether or not that is kind of a match, I guess. So it's got stories from my life, from other people's lives that will just absolutely astonish you, like things that should have easily been believed, obvious truths that were dismissed and ruining a person's life. There's a story in there about a man from Sri Lanka in 2011 who comes and seeks asylum in the UK. He's obviously been tortured, visible torture scars all across his back, in a way that the government in the camps in Sri Lanka are known to torture suspected Tamil Tigers. Right. He comes in with everything just obviously in order. He's obviously been in detention. He has the characteristic scars. All the country reports from Sri Lanka say that, they're using soldering irons on the backs of these suspected Tamil Tigers. And he gets accused of inflicting his own scars. They create a whole new bucket of rejection at the Home Office called self-infliction by proxy, in which they accuse the victim, the survivor, of inflicting their own scars in order to gain UK asylum. And then when you ask the question of how did they reach their own back with soldering iron, they actually said by proxy, as in they hired a doctor to do it. As in a doctor would break the Hippocratic Oath and all of their ethics as a medical person, inflict scars on the back of someone that's so deep and so horrible that they could cause, kind of permanent health and psychological damage in order to gain them asylum to the UK. I mean, it was the most absurd thing ever. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, stories like that. And then there's, of course, other kinds of stories in there. So the book contains stories from various refugee situations, that the wrongfully convicted. I had stories from the Innocence Project, but it also has this strange other side of it, which is that I have the bizarre experience of having been a refugee who then ended up as an MBA student at Harvard, and if there is a place that teaches you how to do the credibility performance, I mean, if you were to say that, we have created and codified a way of being credible for our Western children to help them along the way. I mean, the place where they basically sell this is Harvard Business School. And I guess it was very strange to sit there in that classroom and to receive this instruction and to think, wow, how helpful this would have been in a refugee storytelling situation, or even as a newcomer to the US, and how much of this kind of savviness, believability, credibility, trustworthiness is actually this particular performance and not at all your innate goodness or truthfulness or honesty. And so for me, there's two sides to this. There's all the people who are disbelieved, but then there's all the people who are wrongfully believed, too easily believed. I think a perfect example is someone like Elizabeth Holmes, who didn't even have, why would we think that she had this blood testing technology when she didn't even have a college degree? Why? If you just look at things on paper, you'd be like, absolutely not. But they didn't look at it on paper. They looked at her do the performance.
And I think one of the really fascinating insights that you offer here is this understanding that credibility lies not just in what people say and not just in whose voices and what status they have, but also in the storytelling mechanisms, the genre that are used, the media that are used. And so I suppose the question that I want then to come back at you with is storytelling then the answer? Is more storytelling, different kinds of storytelling in different media and on different platforms? Is that the answer to challenging this disbelief culture that privileges some people over others?
I think it is. I think it's about listening differently, understanding there are different kinds of stories in the world, also taking in many different kinds of stories. I think for refugees in general, to humanize, I guess, these large group of people, it is always good to look at individual stories and to, listen to the details and all of the connections and breakages and all the ways that we feel that as humans. That is always the answer for creating empathy. I think storytelling is the most powerful form of persuasion there is, or good storytelling. But on the other hand, in order to break this very long cycle of just believing certain kinds of people and certain kinds of stories, it has a lot to do with our storytelling education. From a very young age, we learn to take in stories in a certain way. So for example, kind of learned this when I went to the Iowa Writers Workshop. I just remember all the rules were from this very Western way of elegant storytelling. You start things in the middle, you come back around to some satisfactory point. A hero goes on a journey. You have your own agency that takes you from point A to B to C. I mean, these are Western ways of storytelling. In Eastern ways of storytelling, there's all kinds of different rules that go kind of in direct opposition to the Western. For example, in Western storytelling, you are not supposed to have people who are pure good or pure bad. You're not supposed to have black and white characters. You're not supposed to have hand of God events. Everything should be through the agency of the protagonist. In Eastern stories, you don't even always have a protagonist. You have jinns and angels and fairies and good demons coming in and doing things. You have hand of God events, but that's because people don't always have agency there in the way that we're used to having. Great literature is a different thing in the East. And that feeds down to what kinds of stories children are told. So for example, one of the asylum lawyers that I spoke to for Ungrateful Refugee said something really wonderful. He said, he trains people to tell stories in the way that will make Dutch asylum officers believe them. So he said, one of the people that I have the hardest time with, he said, are Iranians. And I said, why? Well, as an Iranian, I want to know this. He said, you ask an Iranian to tell their asylum story or why they escaped the country, and they won't start at the beginning of their troubles with the government, and they won't start at the beginning of, let's say, their conversion or change of heart or whatever led them to on a particular path. They won't start at the moment of their birth. They start at the beginning of the universe. And I said, I know why that is. He said, well, that makes them seem so not credible. It makes them seem shifty, lying. Why are they starting there? And I said, it's because when we're a kid, every single story starts with the beginning of the universe rhyme. There's a little rhyme you say. And the idea is not to be long-winded or confusing. It's to put into perspective this story. This is one story in a universe of stories in a time that has gone back millennia and will continue to go on. There is a sense of humility and perspective to it, but there's also an understanding that your agency is not all. There are things that will happen that are unexpected, but at the end of the day, this story does not matter as much as you might want it to matter. Whereas in the West, we zoom right in, protagonist, hero. So imagine a grandmother who escapes a village in Iran, comes through the Dutch or English or French asylum offices, and is told to be more concise and start at the beginning of things. I mean, a lifetime of this kind of humility. She's not going to start at the moment that the moral police came. She's going to start, if she thinks she's being terribly succinct, maybe at the beginning of Iran's troubles with the West. I don't know, somewhere else, let's say. And I think for us to train ourselves to believe her, not to be suspicious, not to find that shady, we have to start with our own literary education, I suppose, storytelling education, understand where our stories come from, where our triggers and shortcuts come from, and to teach our children a range of stories from around the world.
Absolutely.
That was very long-winded, but that's because I'm Iranian.
It's an incredibly important point to be making there. A very obvious point when you make it, but it's not, as you say, these prejudices, these assumptions, these habits, these cultures of storytelling are deeply ingrained from such a young age, and they absolutely shape who gets believed. So you've talked a little bit about education, and that brings me on to the book The Waiting Place, which again brings multiple stories of forced displacement together. It features 10 young people's stories, not just of displacement, but of living in a refugee camp. And you collaborated with a photographer on that. And I know that you've been using that to take into schools and to do some education around forced migration in schools. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, this was actually done through the very generous support of St. Andrews and the Tate Charitable Trust. And we were given funds to take 6,000 copies of The Waiting Place, give it to students around the UK, and to go and give them talks. So I have a talk that I give to students ages between like 10 and 12 about how to welcome newcomers. There's a wonderful BBC Scotland segment on this a couple of nights ago, which I will send you. The idea is remembering how hard it was for me to arrive from a refugee camp to Oklahoma, how rare and hard won the welcome was, and how much we had been through. I wanted to show children in the UK, here is what they've been through, these kids, before they reach you. Here is how difficult it is to wait, how completely like dispiriting it is, not just to have all your toys taken away and your home taken away and your grandma far away and no school and no sports, but to be told that you don't know when it'll be over, you just have to wait. It kills your fire, and these kids have already been through that. And they've arrived here and they're in your school and they're not going to look or act the way you're used to, but they more than anyone could use a friend. And I think if I could just get that in somewhere near the hearts of the native born children, it would be so much easier for the kids that are arriving, because someone would cut them some slack in terms of how they behave. And someone would invite them to sit down with them at lunch, and then they wouldn't comment on their clothes and they wouldn't correct their words in a mean way, but they would correct them in a nice way. And it would just be that school would be a refuge, a place to go that's great. Like, you're learning your English, you're in this safe place. The school is where your friends are. You skip off to school joyfully. But that is the difference between a great arrival and a really bad arrival. Because even if you're living in temporary housing and you're poor and things are rough, if you go to school and feel like you can play with people and learn and be happy, that's a daily reprieve that will have long-term implications for your mental health and for what you're able to achieve in the world and what talents you're able to cultivate, so much else.
A daily reprieve, and also a sense of taking steps forward rather than still be in that waiting place. That sense that other people are walking with you and you're able to regain your agency.
Yeah. And whereas when I was in the refugee camp, there was this feeling of waiting forever. It would never end. By the way, one of the most wonderful quotes a refugee told me was, waiting in a camp or detention is so much worse than waiting in prison, because in prison, you count down the days, and in camp, you count up the days. There is no knowing when it will end. And that's absolutely true. But the thing is, all that waiting, the psychological impact of that waiting aside, when I arrived in Oklahoma, I thought, great, we've arrived, the waiting is over. And because of the lack of welcome and the bullying, I felt like, oh God, no, now I have to get out of here. I had another place to escape. I kept thinking my mother's escape was from Iran. Now we've come to my escape story. And I spent all of my childhood toiling to get into a place like Princeton or Harvard or whatever, because I thought that was the way out. So I was kind of going through another period of waiting alone. And I don't want children to feel that way now, or that they have to, again, do that kind of absurd thing that I did, that they can live however they want to live. This is the destination. They're good.
Yeah. And not needing to seek refuge from the place of refuge. Dina, it's been amazing talking to you. We've whizzed through your books, and I recommend them heartily to absolutely everyone who's listening. I've just bought The Waiting Place for my children. Through your fiction and your non-fiction writing, you have been challenging assumptions, challenging paradigms for visualizing forced migration. So just a final question. If you could change one thing about how refugees tend to be perceived today, here in the UK or elsewhere, what would it be? What new habits of visualizing forced migration would you like to see becoming established?
I think I would make it so that people understand that this kind of label of refugee, this is a time, it's a short time in one's life. It is not a part of a person's identity. I feel like it's become a part of my identity because of the way things went and the fact that I've chosen to speak about this. But most people don't want it to be any part of their identity. I mean, they were doctors and engineers and craftsmen and artists before, or whatever they were, and that's their identity. The city and family and community they came from is their identity. Their happy stories from home are their identity. And this is a blip, and hopefully it's not a long one. And when they resettle, they want to be remembered for who they are as an individual, not constantly referencing back to this one thing that happened in their lives, as traumatic as it was. So I would say, welcome people with curiosity, welcome people with curiosity about who they actually are, and don't sit on the perch of the rescuer, constantly looking at them as a refugee. Get on the same level, the way you'd welcome a neighbor. What would you ask that neighbor? You would ask what they're into, what their passions are, what their profession is, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so visualizing the whole person, seeing beyond that label, beyond that temporary status, is one of the things that means that status becomes temporary and doesn't become embedded and permanent and something that people are wrestling with all the time.
Lovely way of saying it. Exactly.
Dina, it's been so wonderful talking to you. I'm hugely grateful to you for taking the time. Your writing is such a rich repository for thinking about refugee experiences, multiple refugee experiences, but also the storytelling that has been done around it and the storytelling that can and should be done around forced migration. So thank you very much for talking to me today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure talking to you.
Thank you also to you, our listeners, for joining us again. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Dina Nayeri as much as I did. As I said earlier, her latest book, Who Gets Believed, is out tomorrow on the 9th of March. So do pop along to your local bookshop or order it online. And I heartily recommend her other books too. Do keep tuning into our podcast. As I said at the start, we have a series of episodes coming out, all exploring different aspects of how we visualize forced migration as part of our wider work on war and its aftermath. You can find out more about our work via our project website. The link is in the episode notes. If you have any questions about our work, please do get in touch. You can follow us on social media, just search for Visualising War, or contact us directly by emailing us at viswar@standrews.ac.uk. If you'd like to support our project, please share and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever platform you use so you don't miss an episode. And please do leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It helps people find the show. Our theme music was composed by Jonathan Young. The show was mixed by Zafir Gertin. Thank you for listening.